I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is Synthesis and Sophistry.
I guess one way to introduce our topic today would be to say that Zan and I are going to mansplain Simone de Beauvoir's introduction to the second sex.
Yeah. Something I look forward to.
In terms of her main thesis, Zan, would you share with our audience what de Beauvoir is getting at?
Yeah, I think she lays it out pretty clearly, so I'll just read off what she has written. So, in speaking about women, de Beauvoir says, she determines and differentiates herself in relation to man, and he does not in relation to her. She is the inessential in front of the essential. He is the subject. He is the absolute. She is the other. So in saying this, her thesis is that man is kind of the arbiter of reality. Reality is formed around man, and women are kind of an afterthought. So everything is relative to this absolute, which is man.
Yeah, she writes on page 221, there is an absolute human type that is masculine. And of course, woman is understood in de Beauvoir's frame as an alterity, right? As someone who's an entity that's different or defined by its difference from the default male archetype. This kind of brings us back into themes from our previous discussions. Because before we were talking about mysticism, right? The need to sort of attach labels to things in order to properly intellectually understand them. And it seems that wherever there's a label, there's a debate about a label. Mm-hmm. And whether it's appropriate to draw these lines, what the political significance of those lines being drawn is, and what they ought to be. So, what de Beauvoir does that I think is very good in this article is she draws from a large number of literary, mythological, philosophical, and religious texts and authors, and weaves together in a very well-informed, erudite fashion a sort of web of misconceptions about women that have been made by chiefly male authors and power interest groups throughout the ages, keeping women from realizing their potential.
Yeah, definitely. She goes through quite the list of how women have been essentialized to be this thing naturally in the past. It's unfortunate in a way how much of this is still relevant today, especially some of those arguments from nature and trying to essentialize gender in certain ways. So it's interesting at the same time to read something that this was written in the 60s, I think, or...
Yes. So I think it was the post-war era. The precise year escapes me right now, but it sounds about right. In terms of, let's say, her... What was I going to say before you gave me the year question? Oh, geez, that threw me off.
Sorry.
What were you saying just before you asked me about the year?
Just how it's still relevant nowadays, unfortunately.
Yeah, de Beauvoir is still certified fresh, right? So, that's the tragedy of it, is that it is still so relevant to our lived experience today. It could have been written a few years ago. It could have been written yesterday. It's still important, and I think it's only gained in influence over time. I don't think it's ever been it's never been overlooked since it was written, I think, as one of the keystones of feminist theory. She says at one point on page 220 that clearly No woman can claim without bad faith to be situated beyond her sex. Now, this is an acknowledgement of the predicament of biological woman. I wonder if it also poses some problems for the existentialist ethics that she describes. So on page number 231, towards the end, she writes, "The perspective we have adopted is one of existentialist morality. Every subject posits itself as a transcendence concretely through projects. It accomplishes its freedom only by perpetual surpassing towards other freedoms. There is no other justification for present existence than its expansion towards an indefinitely open future." So, the idea that a class of people, an entire 50% of humans, in a way can't escape their fate biologically, does seem to be at odds with the idea that this project of transcendence is something that we could conceivably hope to succeed at. So there's a challenge here, I think. In a way, it's asking us to defy one of the fundamental realities of nature. Now, you could say that there's nothing natural about the concept of a woman, right? And she says that herself at the beginning of the article that one is not born, but rather becomes woman, or you could say is made a woman by this project of othering. But there are notable differences, right? There are let's say physiological differences at the very least on the whole that are relatively notable, and based on those you sort of build up this whole culture that celebrates or notes or fetishizes this difference. And this is when she describes that you can't ignore the fact that this is part of culture, right? This is a big part of culture. People are coded. People present themselves as one of the two categories and ask to be responded to in that way, in that fashion. And of course, de Beauvoir is writing before, we're really talking about, let's say, non-binary kind of essentialism, or any kind of. She's only talking about male and female as the categories of interest here. Now, of course, later feminists add more nuance to this, but she's tackling, the sort of major schism or divide in most world cultures as she found them. So the question then is, there's this biological difference, or let's say physiological difference, and it gets built up on. And it gets turned into different kinds of clothing and different kinds of rituals. And there's almost like two parallel but unequal, let's say, paths of existential possibilities for the male and the female. How then do we put the brakes on and enter into, let's say, a more ideal world of equality where people once again, or people, if they ever did, where people can have this equality of power in terms of their existential self-determination?
Yeah, I think this is something we brought up before in terms of existentialism, how there is this sort of tension in between this radical freedom they advocate for, but the reality of determined factors in our life. And I think maybe one way that she maybe doesn't solve this tension, but threads the needle, is pointing to the fact that these gender roles do exist for a reason, and we can't just pretend that they're not there. But thinking about it in a more rational way, rather than getting defensive around gender and using essentialist language, like women, using
women are like this.
Yeah.
Well, men are like this.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think, it's interesting for me reading this as someone like now where the topic of gender is at is quite nuanced, and just kind of seeing how much came from her specifically, and this time period of second wave feminism, how it's really evolved since then. And the seeds are here, I think, for this more expansive view.
I mean, it's only because we are of the human species that we're able to ask these kinds of questions and make these kinds of self-determinations, right? I mean, obviously to the salmon swimming upstream during spawning season, they don't stop and ask themselves, hey, wait a minute, what role am I performing here? Swimming up this stream, I'm going to be eaten by a bear. Is breeding really that important to me? Why am I pulled this way and that way by my instinct? I mean, we would just call that a defective salmon, right? That didn't feel any urge to go upstream, just kind of, whatever, you guys do that. I'm staying down here where it's safe. So we humans, we tend to think that we are, in a lot of ways, above these kinds of rudimentary instincts and urges, and are able to determine ourselves to at least some extent, right? This goes back to our discussion of free will and the determinism and relationships, right? We think we have the power to not just behave in an animalistic fashion. However, right, there are some things about life that embarrass this idea of individual and species power. Like when you really have to pee, right? You're kind of like dancing outside the washroom, waiting for the person to leave. At that point, self-determination is a radically distant fantasy, right? You are confronted with biological need in the present, and it's all-consuming. So I think that we have to give some concessions to our embodiedness, and we got to give some concessions to the fact that, I mean, in ways that we barely understand ourselves, we are pulled hither and thither by impulses that impinge on our projects of self-determination. So I think that, again, this is a general criticism of existentialism, not of de Beauvoir in particular, but the idea that an existentialist ethics of moving towards more and greater possibility for self-determination, I think it hits a wall at a certain point, and it has to. Yeah. So I think we have to be content with a more or less modest or moderate amount of progress towards this aim. Because there are things that I am, and there are things that I want to be, and some of the things I want to be, I will never be because of the things I am. Yeah,
but I think, for de Beauvoir, freedom, she says towards the end that freedom is more important than happiness, right? So confining women to these sort of roles that we traditionally have impinges on their freedom, and what a good life and using that freedom, what that is looks different for every person. And when we define women in terms of what is useful or expedient to men, then that is harmful. She also talks interestingly about how certain women can retreat from that freedom and try and inhabit those roles in sort of a bad way because it's more comfortable than facing the dizziness or the anxiety of freedom.
Yeah, this was her point about like why up to this point in history there wasn't a strong solidarity between women as a group. She thinks it's because they're embedded with men at every strata and level of society, and this sort of biological pairing, more or less, pervades all of these different parts of society, which make unified response or reaction to sexism impossible. She thinks that, the workers, in a way, from a socialist point of view, they have it easier. You can identify the property owners as an other and the laborers as a we, and you can kind of engage with that in a more straightforward way. It's not like you're sleeping with the property owners. You're intimately connected with their lives, and you're not essentially concerned with their well-being, and all these vested interests, she thinks, make it more difficult for women to sort of associate with each other across lines of race and class, right? So it's much easier to sympathize with one's husband than a woman from the lower classes who is suffering, she thinks. But then the question, I guess, becomes how to fix that, right? So here's where maybe she describes, as you pointed out in the pre-taping, she describes a lot of the issues that beset women's efforts towards self-determination. She doesn't necessarily give us a lot of normative advice, at least in the introduction part that we're looking at, as to how to advance the cause.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, we should.
Yeah. The one thing that I was thinking about was a philosopher that we had covered in environmental ethics, Karen Warren, and she talked about the logic of domination. She was an ecofeminist and was talking about, what she calls the logic of domination. And the important point I thought here was a sort of value dualism she points out, where you have two opposing things, say either day versus night, man versus woman, rationality versus emotionality. When you have these dualisms, one is always seen as greater than and wins out over the other. And this informs what she calls the logic of domination. So maybe having a bit more scrutiny along those sort of dualisms here, men versus women, and seeing why it is that we value masculinity over femininity. Like, there's been quite a bit of talk about how the classically masculine traits really are just human traits or virtues that we want. So, I think that's part of it, interrogating the water that's around us all the time.
Yeah, again, I think like the inauthenticity and bad faith of inhabiting one's role too faithfully comes into play here, right? So there are some people who adhere to the role of femininity or masculinity to the point where they become cartoonish parodies of humans. So, they have to appear this and such. Some people will undertake radical plastic surgery operations in order to make themselves into what they consider to be the epitome of masculinity or femininity. And it ends up kind of looking strange. It kind of ends up as an uncanny valley effect, right? This is into the realm of, a sort of idealization rather than the way people actually are. So that's, I think, important to think about for sure, is the idea that these roles can trap us. Not just women, but also men. And that we have to be conscious of how much of all of this economic, political, and historical weight presents itself to us as a handy mask that we can just slip on. And that stops all of us. I mean, presumably, we are better able to live more meaningful lives if the people around us are also able to live meaningful lives. That's part of what I assume de Beauvoir means by an existentialist ethics. If women are unfree, then men are less free than they would be if women were also free.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is, why I think scrutinizing and maybe not being so pearl clutching about gender in general is important, because I might be stretching her idea a bit here, but on page 225, she writes, "Indeed, beside every individual's claim to assert himself as a subject, an ethical claim, lies the temptation to flee from freedom and to make himself into a thing. It is a pernicious path because the individual, passive, alienated, and lost, is prey to a foreign will, cut off from his transcendence and robbed of all worth." So I think sometimes, again, like people who cling to their roles too much, it's a rejection of that existentialist freedom. So people will retreat to those sort of traditional masculine or feminine caricatures and try to mold themselves onto those. And yeah, I think this is a problem because for me, I'm someone who thinks that we should let as many different ways of life flourish as possible. And this is a way of reducing down that sort of existentialist freedom, in my view.
Yeah, she's concerned with women being immobilized as an object and men unreflectively enjoying the default position of being an experiencing and valuing subject. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's one of the main pillars of her position.
I guess here I was thinking along the lines, again, I might be stretching her argument, but men who are very frightened of femininity in any sort of way within themselves and how they can reject that as soon as it comes up. And this is a possible path of freedom that they could experience existentially, but they're cutting that off because it frightens them or seems scary.
Yeah. So, this goes maybe into something about masculinity and old school masculinity. So, sometimes I hug my dad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's healthy.
I think so, but I can tell that it makes him uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If I linger too long, he kind of taps out. He's got 2 taps and like that's the hug done. That's the sign like this is enough. This is enough of a hug. Mm-hmm. Any hug that's longer than this would be unmasculine in some way. So I certainly know like that some people probably value, right, or would value a greater feeling of connection with others, but their connection to this idea of masculine aloofness and, let's say stoicism, I suppose, in some way, right? It kind of keeps them isolated. Which, I mean, maybe some people are more comfortable like that, which is fair enough. I don't want to, say everybody should just be hugging it out all the time, in the college quad and just be a hug fest. But, yeah, I think that sometimes, it's just the fear of entering into this unknown or disvalued position which stops people from exploring themselves. I completely see the point and agree. You were saying earlier that just the act of making a distinction can be problematic. I think that you were talking about the eco-feminist position and the logic of domination. I guess like to make a distinction or let's say a category in itself doesn't necessarily imply a judgment as to the value, right? So if, for instance, I have, I don't know, let's say a container full of red jelly beans and a container full of green jelly beans, right? There's nothing implicit in my categorization of those colors that makes one more valuable than the other, except maybe my preference for one over the other. Now, I think that where we get stuck is by conflating the act of categorizing with the presence of a desire or a preference for one over the other. I think that it's possible to look at the male-female divide as the red and green jelly bean distinction, and to be as blasé about it as that, right? And I think that would be preferable, right? It's something you comment on the difference. It's different, but does that difference entail superiority or inferiority? No, it's just different. That's different. Maybe we sort of encounter each other at the onset and well, that's different.
Yeah.
I don't have that. You don't have these, whatever. And I suppose that, that's a kind of, maybe that's a very naive and innocent way of looking at the world. But then again, you got to think about the ideal case sometimes. Wouldn't it be nice if that's all that it meant?
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what de Beauvoir is aiming towards here, rather than, disregarding, I think she rejects the idea that we can just completely do away with sex and gender, at least not right now, as she's saying it. But it's, maybe pasting on those other judgments afterwards that we do that. So, that situation in which it different but equal, I think, is a more desirable world to live in.
Yeah, but then again, to the demands of justice in the abstract might mean that we have to look upon unlike as unlike, right? So, for example, in socialist countries, we often have things like paternity and maternity leaves for parents. And traditionally, the maternity leave is something that, has been especially important for women who otherwise would have no source of income or would have their careers dramatically shortened or weakened by a pregnancy. Now, I understand that there are some fringe cases which are being discussed, but by and large, the vast majority of pregnancies are experienced by biological women, right? So it would seem that the demands of justice and the demands of an existentialist ethics might mean working in some access to resources to allow people who want to have children the ability to be economically, let's say, empowered during this phase when they're expected to be less able than they normally would be to earn or to excel in their career. Yeah,
I think that this is like the point with equality, right? Equality doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets the same treatment. A grown adult probably gets to eat a bit more than a young child would, but it's equal to their needs, I guess, to quote Marx.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to, in not making distinctions, in refusing to categorize, we could also create injustice, is what I'm saying. Okay. So if I just say, well, we're all human beings, so nobody gets any special treatment, right? But we're clearly, different in important ways that have economic and political consequences. So, how about we accommodate that, or how about we take that into account when we're trying to fix society?
Yeah, and to go back to roles, right? Every role has its good aspect as well as its maybe worse aspects or more dangerous aspects about it. You being a teacher, that role gives certain goods that are important. But I think this is why interrogating every role, right, is important, and thinking critically about it, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's nothing there's nothing wrong with categorizing. There's nothing wrong with, in fact, making judgments based on categorizations, except when these are result in inequalities or inegalitarian results, and they reflect prejudices or biases that are not well considered or defensible, right? So I think that we are not on a different page than de Beauvoir, but maybe I feel like othering it's almost inevitable. Right, it's a bit like that. Again, this is maybe not so great, but bringing up Carl Schmitt, right, and his sort of friend-enemy distinction, right? Like, in order to have any sort of group, you need to have a different group to define that group with reference to, and that's just what it means to have a sort of political unit or any other kind of conceptually distinct social unit. It's like, this group of people has this going on. This group of people are different in that way. Now, de Beauvoir has acknowledged that women are not a political other, really, so to speak. They're enmeshed all across the board. So then, what are the chances of this sexual difference resulting in any kind of political unity? It doesn't work according to de Beauvoir. Would it work for Schmitt? I mean, it's not sustainable, I don't think, in the long term, to have, say, an island of Amazons over here and dudes only on this island. That's probably not the way forward for society. So it completely othered sex would be to the benefit of hardly anyone, I would think.
Yeah, and I guess
like a segregated sex.
Yeah,
right.
I mean that might make for an interesting like sci-fi novel.
Yeah, but, or a game show. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's where my disagreement with Schmitt comes from. Like we can reconcile those differences, not completely maybe, but they don't have to be as pronounced as they are now. And I think that's through I was just listening to a podcast about Byung-Chul Han. I think that's how you say it. And he talks about the importance of really like trying to understand the other, not just battling them in their own head, but really sitting down and listening to them and trying to understand them as a person. And I think that's reading de Beauvoir, because she doesn't really give you that this is what we ought to do rather than an existentialist framework, but that's kind of where my mind goes.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this this fear of engagement and this kind of artificial and false sense of purity keeps political groups and people from different sexes from engaging with each other productively. And so I think like these are obstacles to projects of self-realization, and they're counter to projects of political reconciliation, and the enemy of the enemy of anti-sexist progress, I think. Yeah, and again, not to make it too hot button, but American politics, I think, suffers from this.
Yeah,
greatly, right?
Yeah.
So like you feel like maybe just even talking to an arch conservative might infect you with reactionary values, and so you don't even bother trying to. And in a way, I kind of sympathize, because I've had lots of horrible, go nowhere discussions with people who, from my position, were just absolutely wrong-headed and couldn't be convinced of the fact that they weren't seeing the whole picture, or that they had some fundamental thing wrong. And I've given up on pressing that kind of discourse now. Whereas when I was younger, maybe I would, engage with that, and I would thrash it out, and I would try to learn something from the other side. And I feel like maybe this is one of my personal vices. I've gotten a bit lazier about trying to step over that political divide. I see it coming, oh geez, this person's going to start talking about this, and then I I kind of duck out of engagement because I just don't have the energy for it.
Yeah, I think at some level you have to. I think sometimes people, it's a different line for every person. Yeah, I've had conversations where people just aren't going to listen to anything you have to say. And generally with those, I just stop trying to convince them of anything and just kind of hear what they have to say. But again, at some point, I'm like, okay, you're too far out there, or you're being hateful. I'm not into this anymore.
So that's a kind of othering,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You've made a distinction. You've made a judgment. My position is better than your position, and you can't be convinced, and therefore I put you in that camp of the other. You are not to be conversed with.
Yeah, but I think that you can expand where that line is more and more. But I think there's always going to be a line. Some people are convinced the world is flat, and that's all there is to it.
Right.
And
trying to talk them out of that belief is going to drive you mad.
yeah.
Because they will not be convinced.
Yeah.
Regardless of the evidence that you produce or the reasonable premises that you introduce, they will all be denied and rejected categorically, and you will resign yourself sooner or later to that fact.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, while we're on the topic of epistemology, one thing that I thought was interesting, de Beauvoir at one point at the top of 221, she says, "Woman is the negative to such a point that any determination is imputed to her as a limitation without reciprocity. I used to get annoyed in abstract discussions to hear men tell me, 'You think such and such thing because you're a woman.' I know my only defense is to answer, 'I think it because it's true,' thereby eliminating my subjectivity." So, yeah, I think with regards to epistemology, this is why, looking at these sort of biases that have favored men historically is important, because people from different backgrounds can view the world differently and bring about new knowledge that we might not have gained if we're just to dismiss it as hysteria or women's thoughts.
Yeah. I think that's fairly clear and straightforward. And I think that actually the idea that de Beauvoir has here of responding, well, you think that way because you're a man, I think that's actually probably more acceptable and expressible in today's discourse. And I think that, what she could only construct as a remote political possibility is now very common and very everyday. To say, you think that because you're a man. Yeah. I think that's fine. That's what we hear a lot.
Yeah.
That's what I hear a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, it's true to some extent, but you don't, for me, you don't want to go too far with that idea, right?
You don't want to essentialize male thought any more than you want to essentialize female thought.
Yeah, but I think it's important to recognize differences and backgrounds and how we interact with the world.
I mean, I think that, you don't have to be a woman to appreciate the negative implications of toxic male culture. Like, I think that, we can see how it negatively affects both men and women, without, having to completely jump out of our embedded, let's say, position. We can hopefully, right? That's the whole point of this intellectual exchange business that we call philosophy, is that we're able to, hopefully, through our words and our thoughts, approach a common understanding that would be impossible if we didn't put in this effort. And it doesn't require any sort of, it's better if it's served up with a dollop of empathy, but it doesn't necessarily require that as an ingredient.
No. I guess when I think about like epistemology from different backgrounds, though, it's people bringing attention to things that maybe are blind spots for other groups. But yeah, at the end of the day, everyone should be able to communicate on the same level, and no one has special knowledge once it's out there. It's more pointing things out, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's the other thing, right? Is when you do fetishize one over the other, it always results in a sort of parody, right? Like, my special women's intuition tells me. That's a sort of mystical faculty. It reminds me of, the old discussions about, Orientalism, right? The sort of othering of Asian traditions that's the inscrutable way that this people or that people conduct their business, and we could never understand it, right, as Westerners. And that's not helpful. No. That's not healthy. And neither is sort of leaning too hard on your gender identity or your biological sex as a repository for special understanding that can only be shared with members of your gender group or biological sex. I think that's not helpful for any old person. So if there's anything good about the existentialist project here, right, it's the fact that it asks us to, if we can, as much as we can, transcend these obstacles to our projects of self-realization, and to arrive at, again, as best we can, a common ground where we respect each other's projects of liberation. Yeah. Now that might be, you could say that, the problem with the second sex is the same problem with every existential position in the line of Jean-Paul Sartre, which is that it is overly demanding. It asks too much of us. It requires us to do things to overcome facts about ourselves and the universe which are insurmountable, right? So, if you're talking about the slaves who built the pyramids in ancient Egypt, asking them to, enter into a project of transcendence which enables them to embody, in a way that exhibits good faith, their true values, it's a bit much, right? So this whole philosophy, and this is one of the things that you can chuck at existentialism, is that it requires people to have the resources and the education and the free time and all that stuff required to construct and then execute on these meaning-creating and sustaining projects. Yeah. And sometimes that's just not possible. And if you're cynical and if you're pessimistic about the role of women in the world then and today, you could say the same thing, that the obstacles are just too daunting for a lot of women to embrace this existentialist model of self-transcendence.
Mm-hmm. I'm not super familiar. I brushed up on it, but the history of feminism, I guess this was one critique that the later feminists levied against de Beauvoir, right? That she was mostly including white upper class women in her philosophy. Yeah, I guess this is where solidarity would help.
Yeah, and there's something maybe she's writing about herself, sort of knowingly here, right? Mm-hmm. Talking about the lack of solidarity between, women of various races, at various social classes.
Yeah, I guess maybe this speaks to how the framework of feminism has expanded a lot over time. So it's not just looking at differences between men and women so much, but also different groups of women in South America or underdeveloped countries, trying to expand that idea, I guess, and seeing what's available for them to engage in meaningful projects.
Yeah, I mean, you could defend de Beauvoir against these charges by saying that, well, she's laying the groundwork, and obviously there's, urgent economic, socio-political work that needs to be done. But that's not her wheelhouse, right? And so maybe you could say that that's that charge of, white, rich, elitist kind of, position that she may be writing from. Maybe that's the case. Maybe that's the case, but it's also the case that that's not where she's, let's say, conceptually equipped to help out the best, right? And so she's an existentialist philosopher, and so she stays, on the rails, right, in terms of that. Now, that being said, she does draw into her account, again, there's a lot of strings in her bow, and she does talk about various political, social, economic, mythological, and religious perspectives that, she shows that there's a network of overlapping, let's say, power structures that all work to reduce women to the status of an object. So I think that's pretty good. Yeah. That's pretty good. Even if you nitpick and say, well, yeah, that's easy for her to say. Yeah. It is, maybe, but at the same time, she did what she could, and I feel like, it's and again, I've got some deeper sort of theoretical worries about the possibility of making progress along those lines, but I think that, for what it is, she gives us an inspirational goal. Whether or not we can actually achieve it is a different matter, but it's worth something.
Yeah, I think
it's better that she wrote this than she didn't.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's why reading this is so interesting to me, because you see the seeds of so many ideas in here, and because we were talking about this article, and this is within a wider chapter about feminism in general. I just skimmed through Mary Wollstonecraft's article beforehand, and feminism, I guess, is a fairly modern conceptual framework. So it's just interesting to see how each idea is kind of building upon each other and expands further. So I think her contribution, can be seen all over the place nowadays in really interesting ways. And sometimes it's interesting to go to the early philosophers and then see how people help them out later on in expanding their ideas.
Yeah, I think here's where philosophy helps rather than hurts. I think that if you really drink the cultural Kool-Aid, you can assume that what are cultural differences in sex roles reduce to biological differences in sex. I think a lot of people who don't reflect upon this philosophically tend to make that conflation. Mm-hmm. Men be like this and women be like this, and they'll always be like that, and my culture reinforces that, so that's the way it is. And that's a neat, tidy package. It's very efficient for understanding the world. It is misguided. It leads to distortion and mistakes, but it's easy to use. Mm-hmm. That's the one advantage that has, but it comes at a great cost. So I think that philosophy cleaves that difference between the mere biological difference and all the immense cultural baggage that's tacked onto that mere physiological difference, right? Yeah. So I think that's the good that de Beauvoir is doing here, right? She's saying that all this stuff, we built this on these little mounds of flesh. We created this huge difference that creates wide swaths of injustice and huge problems for projects of self-realization, and we shouldn't.
Yeah.
So I think that's good.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's an important contribution to philosophy, and I think our political landscape too. It's invaluable.
So I guess again, I kind of wish we had a female guest on this week, because it does kind of sound like we're tapping de Beauvoir on the back. These two chappies. Oh well, she did very well.
Yeah.
I don't want to. It falls upon us to evaluate each of the authors that we consider, but we do have to acknowledge that in this particular subject, we are visitors to this landscape, and what we can try to do is to build a bridge to it intellectually, but also acknowledge that we will never, in de Beauvoir's terms, and this is on page 230, we will never grasp immediately what the fact of being female means for a human being, and she notes that women care more about knowing it, right? We are intellectually curious, but we might not feel the political urgency of understanding what being female means. Mm-hmm. And I think that's our job as conscious men, is to try the best we can, when we can, to do this, to do this kind of empathetic, considerate thought exercise.
Yeah, and I think just trying not to dig our heels in or get defensive, because that's definitely a temptation, I think, with these sort of topics, to fall back onto more traditional or comfortable ideas around sex and gender for men. I think again, we're guests to it, but I do always try to look at everything I look at in some critical way. I guess the two things we kind of brought up: one, she doesn't really have a lot of normative things she's putting forward. She's just kind of pointing things out. And then two, it's more a critique of the greater existentialist project. If I can kind of map out the two critiques that we brought up today. Yeah.
And I think, again, like, it's going to help if we lay on some real world experiences, right? Because I think that helps ground the discussion. Yeah. So I'll give you an example of where my male privilege tripped me up. I was meeting my then girlfriend in Tokyo, and I was 15 minutes late to our meeting, and this was in Shinjuku, which is quite a busy subway station. And when I got there, she was incredibly irked with me. And I was like, well, I'm just 15 minutes late. And, I had this delay and that delay. I'm very sorry, but here I am. And the mood was sour, and the day was ruined in a way because I was 15 minutes late. Now, you could say that it's that person's response, but I had a discussion with them. I said, so what is it about me being 15 minutes late that makes this the federal case? And then she educated me. She goes, do you know how many unwanted looks and advances and comments that were made during those 15 minutes with me being a woman standing around outside of a subway station? And again, like, that was a point where I hadn't really thought carefully about that fact and how the resentment and the irritation would build up during the time waiting for me. Yeah. So I suppose that, with a little bit of better education at that point in my life, I would have been more hip to her discomfort in that situation. But I had to be, and again, this requires patience and goodwill on both sides. These things have to be explained when you don't live these facts. Because I could stand outside of a subway station for 50 minutes. I'm pretty sure that no one would bat an eye. I mean, maybe in my prime, they would have. There would have been a few passes.
I think you're selling yourself short.
I mean, I've got to hang out for a lot longer in front of a subway station now, comparatively. But I'm just saying, relatively speaking, I'm going to experience less frustration and irritation doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, if there's a message for, for long-suffering women out there, it's maybe take the time to break it down for your ignorant but well-intentioned male friends. Let them know how they're stepping on your nerves, and maybe, just maybe, you can get through to them. And, obviously, since I'm still talking about this, what is it now? Nearly 20 years later, it's still something that stuck with me, right? It's not something that I lost or forgot or disvalued. I try to think more carefully and more intensely about these kinds of things. I still fail sometimes. I'm still late sometimes. That's a personal failure. I'm trying to get better at that. But
yeah. Well, yeah, again, it's a banality, but I think this is why communication is always important. Trying to understand the other is always better than reinforcing those tensions between the other. So, Chris, what do we think? Do boys rule and do girls drool? Are we?
I don't know if that's not the way that de Beauvoir breaks it down necessarily. I think that she's trying to say that women should rule as much as men do, and maybe there's this possible society where we can all be self-governing, autonomous individuals without the need to slap roles on each other and make each other into objects.
All right, I think we've squeezed.
We've solved sexism.
Yeah, feminism solved.
High five. Until next week.
All right, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Sam.